Thank you for having the Amerindian Peoples Association make a presentation. I will be more in the form of a verbal presentation here. I want to bring to the attention of everyone here that the experience of indigenous peoples in Guyana has been extremely limited in relation to oil and gas, the oil and gas sector. Starting with, for example, the EIAs or the ESIAs that speak to or what should have indigenous people's input has been extremely limited. There is no access or direct or accessible way for indigenous communities to directly get copies of the ESIAs, the documents. That is the two-phase documents and all of that. While the APA has been invited at least on one or two occasions, it has been challenging for staff from the APA to fully be engaged and to make representation to these times. We, however, have submitted at least one formal comment to the EPA, citing these very challenges and concerns, making recommendations that there needs to be appropriate participation, inclusion of indigenous peoples, and not only for communities that are along the coast, but for indigenous peoples throughout Guyana. It is imperative that indigenous peoples' rights are respected and their concerns are substantially included in any process discussion going forward. Indigenous peoples throughout Guyana need to be prepared to participate in consultations and in further decision-making processes. Capacity building of indigenous peoples is needed for us to understand what an oil rig or an oil spill is all about. Especially that here in Guyana as well, this is the first time we're talking about extraction of oil. Indigenous peoples or indigenous communities also need capacity building so that we can be technical persons, independent technical persons, as ourselves, being able to quantify impacts on the environment, impacts on human life, indigenous peoples, and on our livelihoods as well. There are indigenous communities that are directly benefit from or are reliant on the fishing industry along the coast, and that is where also direct engagement, capacity building and support of indigenous communities along the coast also needs to take place. In response or in relation to the potential impacts, information that is contained in documents, official documents, that the APA, for example, has been able to see online is very technical. And these need to be presented to indigenous communities so that we can understand, with perhaps a friendly guide to what these mean and what a readily accessible process looks like for engagement and participation. Information sharing and consultation needs to be understood in Guyana that there are two different things. Information sharing should have happened with indigenous communities as to what this means, and also going beyond the potential impacts on the environment, livelihoods, but also for us to understand how we can become engaged and involved and participate in the wealth that we are promised so much. What does it mean? Because for example, Guyana's Green State Development Strategy speaks to developing sustainable development of Guyana, but what does it mean for indigenous peoples is still to be fully understood and documented in these policies and further legislative development. The Natural Resource Fund and everything else that is speak to and laws that have been passed through Parliament has not been accessible for input to indigenous communities and indigenous peoples. Because development for indigenous peoples may not necessarily be what the national policy makers see as development for Guyana. To this end, the APA has continually called for the rights of indigenous peoples to free, prior, and informed consent to be respected. We believe that this right is still to be fully implemented, because many times what we find is that decisions or designs of policies, of projects, are made prior to bringing us to the table. And then indigenous peoples are expected to endorse this already designed framework, and that is not enough. So rights violations and the violation of right to FPIC, that needs to change. Perhaps it's time for indigenous peoples to develop and receive from Guyana what an indigenous people's policy can look like, or what it may look like. Because on one hand, it can be something positive. On the other hand, it can end up being a double-edged sword. How can indigenous peoples then design and propel what the future should look like for us as indigenous peoples, for our generations? Technology is at the cutting edge. How might we then use technology to ensure that indigenous peoples are also the driving force behind the development in the oil and gas sector? What might the spin-offs or the offsets might be from oil and gas, royalties, or economic development? Infrastructural development through hinterlands, building of roads, while it is a good thing, if indigenous peoples are not involved and given control how this happens, how it evolves, it can mean road building, infrastructural road building, and other township establishments, for example, with support of these royalties, or funded by royalties, can have negative impacts on indigenous peoples. Because what development can also mean to indigenous peoples is that it ends up swallowing us in the whole development rhetoric and spit us out when it's finished. And so indigenous peoples need to harness an opportunity where we are the designers within and providing solutions to Guyana's national framework for development with the booming oil and gas development today.